Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, I guess. But thank you for joining us today anyway for LoopUp Live Talking Teams. And today we are talking about successfully rolling out Microsoft Teams calling, secrets in the field. So I guess to that end, I better introduce Adrian, who I'm with. Adrian, you're Director of Delivery or Project Manager, I guess, in other words,
Right.
for us at LoopUp. So I
Right.
think we're going to have a little chat about the kind of end-to-end project process, some of the common pitfalls, where it is that you and your team add value, how that works, all that sort of stuff. So
Yep.
I guess from a maybe starting at a scene setting point of view, if we're talking about Teams telephony, and more specifically, we're talking about Teams direct routing because that's what we're offering, and therefore that's what you're dealing with delivery.
Yeah.
Um, why do we need a project manager involved in that? Don't we just sort of give you the configuration to the customer? This is our gateways. This is how you need to configure a user, and off you go. Like, why? Where do you fit in?
Sure. So to be honest, like all those pieces that you talked about, I think the bit where the PM adds value is really stitching those pieces together. So sure, the customer's got their Teams tenant. They want the direct routing solution, which LoopUp can provide, but we provide the details on how you would set that up. Also,
Okay.
we do this day in, day out, and the kind of pitfalls we see all the time, talking to your losing carrier and how long that kind of piece takes. That's kind of where we add the value, really.
Good stuff. And I mean, you and I have been through the fire for many years or many
We
projects
certainly
together,
have, yeah.
ranging from Skype for Business and Link and a few other bits and pieces in between. Do you see that are there particular challenges around the types of projects that you're doing now, which are these cloud telephony migrations versus stuff that the customers might have done so far?
Yeah, I think the key challenge. So, in some ways, these projects have got a lot simpler. So back in the day, when you and I were doing this back on Skype days, and we had to get the server specs over to the customers, all those kind of things, those pieces have gone away because it's all dealt with within the Teams tenant. Now it's understanding how you configure the tenant and how it's going to affect your end users. So actually, you can end up providing a better service to the end user, but knowing how to navigate that Microsoft environment is kind of how it's changed over time.
Yeah. And okay, so it's interesting. So you're saying, the kind of nitty gritty hands-on tech stuff has kind of gone away a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and it's now
Yep.
more procedural. What of these choices do you want out of the configs available, et cetera, et cetera. So how much
Yeah.
of what you're doing is interfacing with kind of loop up behind the scenes stuff that customers don't necessarily see, and how much is customer facing stuff that has to happen in their tenant, in their environment, that they need to have input to?
I think people would be surprised about the amount of stuff that's going on in the background, because when a project first lands, we'll have an internal call and we'll understand. We'll pick up from where the pre-sales consultant's been speaking to the customer. We'll understand all the pains they've got and any of their kind of unique requirements. Because, like I said, it's all Teams direct routing and it's plugging into the LoopUp environment. But customers
Yeah.
might have analog device requirements, or they might have had a problem with devices in the past. There might be a perception within the business that people don't want to wear headsets and they want handsets. So we kind of learn that piece, and then we'll engage with the support team nice and early to say, okay, this customer is going to be coming along and these are the kind of requirements they've got. And by the way, we'll keep you in the loop when we roll out office by office, or however the rollout approach is going to take place.
So there's a couple of things you talked about there that maybe, could you kind of give me a run through end to end of where your engagement starts and where your engagement finishes? Because kind of my side of stuff is I'm pre-sales consulting. So that's, figuring out with the customer what challenges, what we can support, what we can't support, and getting to the point of, agreeing a price and deciding to move forward. Like, is that where you take over, or?
Exactly that. So it'll come across as close one, but to be honest, we'll have been talking with you before the sales process is closed. So we'll be talking on a weekly basis where we know the kind of customers that are going to be coming down the line. We will then pick up, we'll engage with the customer. We'll drop an email out first of all to say, hey, this is close one. So, it doesn't go silent from our side. We'll have those initial internal configuration conversations. We'll then reach out to the customer. We'll arrange a kickoff call. We'll let them know the kind of things they need to get onto right away. So, have they got all of their network information? Have they got all the information they're going to need from their losing carrier? It's all the kind of stuff that's going to be kind of long lead items we want to get out there right away. And then depending on the cadence and how quickly the customer needs to move, we might move into a weekly call. So we'll have a
Yep.
RAID log and we'll run through where we are with the pieces. It might be twice weekly, of course, depending on how quickly the customer wants to move. We'll then, we'll probably already have an idea by that stage of how they want to roll out the different office locations. I'll then be engaging with the support team and letting them know when those pieces are going to happen. We'll help the customer through when the port actually happens. We'll have someone on standby. We'll have someone there the next day after the port to be able to support their end users. And then typically at the end of the project, we'll wrap all that up. We'll get your design document. We'll get any kind of documentation pieces that we picked up during the project, hand that over to you. So the customer has that piece and they can do with it what they will. And we hand that over to our support team as well. And we'll have introduced them to the support team before that. So they'll be comfortable at how to raise tickets and engage with the next team.
So, again, like that's all very well. That's, our process for LoopUp. But there's a few things you mentioned there about gathering networking information and, speaking to your carriers and that sort of stuff. I'm assuming those are things that, regardless of who the solution is being provided by, if it's in-house, if it's someone else, if it's us, those are probably common elements because that's stuff to do with Teams config. So could you elaborate a little bit? Like what's the networking information? Why do we need that?
So there's two parts there. So one thing we hear all the time now is, I don't need to worry about the network. We've got 100 meg pipe coming into our office, and that might be true. And 9 times out of 10, it will be okay. But we've had it. We've had occasions in the past where Microsoft have a tool where you can install a piece of software on a node, ideally on a laptop, maybe ideally in all of your offices, maybe on Wi-Fi and one on wired. We can help the customers run that for a period of a week and help them identify any bottlenecks they might have with their Wi-Fi, or we might see traffic routing in a strange way from one location to another. And the network might have been working fine for years with Microsoft Exchange data, because you're still going to get the email at the end of the day. When you're looking at real-time data, like a video call, then this kind of stuff is crucial.
So what you're talking there is kind of networking best practices of validating that the network is going to be okay to support the workload that you're looking at putting on it, right?
Exactly, just so there'll be no surprises later on down the line. The last thing we want is to roll out to live users and the live users have the poor experience. We'd rather help the customer identify those early and help them find a solution for it.
And I've seen you also asking customers for their subnet information and switch information and Wi-Fi. That's not to do with quality, I'm guessing, or is it? Where does that play in?
So where that fits in is we don't have to get that day one. You could roll out Teams and you wouldn't need to gather that kind of information. But later on, when you've rolled out to the end users and you've got someone in the New York office who's complaining about call quality, if you've provided that information, so that's kind of subnet information. So if you've got a user in the New York office, if you give us all this information, we could help you find out that was a switch that was misbehaving on the 3rd floor. Just the more information you give us, the better. In addition to that, in the US, obviously there's requirements around dynamic E911, which are coming into law from January next year.
That's
all that kind
emergency
of
calling, right?
Yeah, exactly. So all that information is going to be crucial for those locations as well.
Okay, so I guess that sort of stuff is almost a little bit pre-flight, but you use it at the end of a project. What else would a customer need to be looking at? You mentioned carriers.
Yeah, the real big one, the one that trips up everybody, is carrier information. So if you're coming to a company like LoopUp, you'll be moving your numbers across to our platform. We need to know, and it's crucial, we need to know the billing address, the number ranges, and the lead number. That's a bare minimum. A lot of customers think they've got this, but actually when you start digging, you find out they've actually got they're using some of the numbers from a larger range. If we don't have information day one, that kind of delays the process.
But is that not generally just the information on their bill? Do they not just need to find a bill and give it to you?
So if they give us a copy of the bill, that's great. A step beyond that, you might want to engage with your losing carrier and ask for what's known as a CSR, or a customer service record, and that's got all of that information zipped up a little bit better. Beyond that, there are certain countries where you might have other requirements, such as business registration documents. You might need to provide ID. You might need to provide proof of address. This is all stuff LoopUp. We do this on a regular basis, so we know the kind of pitfalls you're going to find in certain regions. So certainly when you're going through the pre-sales process, speak to the pre-sales consultant about the locations you're going to be looking at, and they'll be able to talk with the delivery team.
And is that just a problem for porting numbers, or is that also an issue for new numbers?
It can be new numbers, depends on the region. New numbers are usually a little bit easier, but certain regions, they're still going to require stuff like that. They'll still want to register those numbers against your business registration.
And I guess this must be the bit that you hate most out of a project delivery, because it's the bit that's most out of your control, right? Because you can do
exactly
all the LoopUp config, all the tenant config, all the Teams config, but if you don't have numbers from whoever the carriers underneath are, there's nothing you can do. So
it's always the long lead item within a project, I find. So it's good to get that straight out there nice and early.
So is that the recommendation? Is go talk to your current carrier, get a CSR, and plan for that. It's like what would you recommend around porting? Because the porting process is like 4 to 6 weeks sometimes, depending on geographies. How do you accommodate for that in a project plan? What do you do?
So we would work with the customer. We'd try to find out which locations. So they might just have offices in the US. US ports usually more straightforward. Europe still relatively straightforward, but can take a little bit longer. But then we'd be looking out for more difficult countries, such as places in South America or Asia. These things can take a lot longer, and you won't always get the initial requirements from the carrier. So you'll submit the information, then they'll come back and ask for more. But again, we've been through this many times, so we can help.
So basically, like get that in as early as you can, and then what can you delay the ports or push them back if you need to?
Exactly. That's what I'd always recommend. So put the request in. The carrier will give you a date. We can work with you, and then we can push those dates back depending on when we think we're going to be ready. When we've got the tenant configured, when we've communicated to all of the end users, and we can push that date out to when we need to.
Okay. So if we're doing a virtual checklist, that's networking information, that's carrier information for new numbers or for porting. Kind of what comes next? Do you deal with doing pilot phases and early adopters on the platform and that sort of stuff?
Exactly that. So user adoption's a real key piece as well. I think a lot of times where people go wrong, a lot of times these projects are driven by IT. So the IT team know the benefits of moving to a unified communication solution, but certain people in the business might not. So what we find is they'll run a pilot and they'll run it with the IT team. Problem with the IT team is they're all fairly tech savvy. So if they've got a problem, they'll understand why and they'll be more accepting of it, or they'll find a workaround for it. What you really want to do is you want to identify people in your business, such as PAs, because they're usually pretty vocal within the business. And if you can, a C-suite exec, somebody who's got buy-in, who understands and likes this technology and wants to help you drive it forward. So don't just focus on the IT people for the pilot. Try to find a widespread across the business, and maybe in different geographies as well.
You'd have them as part of your broader project team. Would they be part of who you would usually be interfacing with a customer, or is that for a customer PM to be driving on their side?
Probably for a customer PM to be driving on their side, but we can provide the information that they would need to engage with those people. But if they wanted to get more engaged, then sure, they could have been involved as much or as little as they want in the day-to-day project.
Okay. And what's your kind of favorite sort of a project? I'm imagining that these are fairly straightforward, fairly cookie cutter, that one's very similar to another, or does it get more complicated where, for example, on some of others of these calls we've talked about needing to deploy local SBCs? Is that something that you roll your eyes and is a whole nother challenge, or is that fairly straightforward? And
so like you said, the core offering, so the customer's Teams tenant and Teams direct routing, we're very good at doing that, and we can help a customer realize a solution fairly quickly. But yeah, there's certain country where there's regulations where services can't be provided, so they'll have to be on-prem SBCs, or the customer might have fax solutions that they just cannot get rid of, or they've got a system that connects to the alarm or a lift or something like that. But we just take those on a one-by-one basis, and like how we said, we'd pick the countries that are maybe going to be the easiest to go, and then the more difficult countries, we'll build the SBC planning into that. And it might be physical devices that need to be ordered and shipped to locations, and if that's the case, then there'll be design sessions where we'll go through and understand the requirements and have that signed off before anything's ordered and shipped to those locations.
And so in this process, how much involvement would you be expecting, or input would you need from a customer? Is it a sliding scale, or is it they always need to do a huge amount, a small amount? How does that kind of work?
It's very much top loaded. So if the customer can put the time in up front, so going and getting that CSR report, going and getting the subnet information, understanding the users, the phone numbers that are associated with the users, maybe a bit of an audit of your Active Directory. Is it up to date and does it have all of the accurate information? Running exports on your current phone system. There'll be a lot of work up front, but once that upfront work's done and it's handed over to us, we'll be able to take that off the customer and help them plan, and then there'll be a lot less required on the customer. It would be just be them turning up to the calls and kind of planning from that point.
So again, that's kind of a general tip, isn't it? That regardless of who or how you're doing it, it's making sure you have accurate data for which to base the project and the rest of the assumptions on, right?
100%. Yeah.
Okay. And then what happens when you've, like you were talking about a cadence of having weekly calls, whatever a customer needs, that, you kind of get you do information gathering, you do prep, then you do a pilot, and then you move into the migration phase. Does that kind of change the level of interfacing with a customer that you need, or the level of work that they need to be doing, or does that just kind of turn into a repeatable thing?
It turns into a repeatable thing, and you learn the appetite for risk from certain customers. So typically they'll be very nervous. You'll then do your first pilot, and they'll see things that actually go according to plan, and they become a lot more comfortable with it. So, and then it's kind of up to the customer. Some customers are very hands off at that point, and they go, great, we'll just communicate to the business when you're going live with this location. Or you have other customers who will want people sitting on a bridge when the port happens, doing testing at that time, and then being available the day after in case the users have any issues. But it's really on the kind of risk appetite from the customer. But we're quite flexible in that.
So you've opened yourself up for a question there. What's the worst thing that you've had happen during a deployment? You're talking about the risk and the issues. Like what's the hardest thing you've had to kind of deal with?
It's probably again, it's number porting. So we're very good. It's the bits we control, so we can configure the tenants, and we've got everything ready on our side. It's when it's with the carrier, and it feels like a bit of a black box. We don't really know what's going on that side. So the way we mitigate that is we've got very good relationships with the account managers in all of these locations. They'll be aware of when these ports are coming up. We'll have, if it's out of hours in the UK, typically the PM will still be involved, and we'll pass any information on to the support team. So ticket numbers, there'll be escalation paths within the carriers, and we kind of mitigate those risks that way.
Yeah. Okay. So from the project team point of view, then who is it on the LoopUp side that you would be getting to do the work? Is there many teams of people that you're having to pull in to make that happen behind the scenes?
So you in the pre-sales process, you'll have engaged with one of the very skilled and knowledgeable LoopUp pre-sales consultants. They don't just throw that over to the delivery team. They'll be involved, so they'll kind of be the technical architects. So they'll have been there since inception with the customer, and they'll understand all of the customer pain points. They're typically still involved, maybe not joining every kind of weekly call, but if there's a question, we'll take that away, and if we need to, we'll bring them back in with the customer. But typically, it'll be handed over to a project manager, and usually an engineer or two engineers, depending on the size of the project.
Okay. And so in that life cycle, then, prep, pilot, deploy, how do you close that out? What does a successful deployment look like? How do you sign that off?
So just before that, so prep, and then we've got kind of thorough testing. So we've got our systems acceptance testing, which is where we run end to end. We have scripts where we'll run through and make sure everything's working as expected. We then hand a user acceptance testing script to the customer. It's very important. This is an off-the-shelf user acceptance testing, which the customer needs to look at, and any kind of interesting reception scenarios or meeting rooms, we'd urge the customer to plan those out and build those into the testing. We'll then go into the pilot, and depending on the risk appetite of the customer, we might run those SAT and UAT tests per site just as they're about to go live. We might take some test numbers before we actually do the port and make sure everything's working as expected.
Yeah.
Then we would get to the end of the project, and we have what's called a CSR, which we send over to the customer. It's their opportunity to say if there's anything that's been missed, or there are any snagging items. Once the customer's completely comfortable, they'll sign off that CSR, and we'll close out the project. And we'll have already introduced them to the support team by that point, and they'll be comfortable raising tickets.
you could argue maybe that there's so many moving parts in the team's telephony deployment between the headset a user's got, the type of laptop or computer that they're on, the network connection, the our gateways and the Azure connections that they sit behind, the real carriers underneath. Do you end up in, when you're going through those user acceptance testing and system acceptance testing, having to kind of defend certain elements of the platform and finger pointing back to that it's other elements, or but how does that work? Because it could be, you could see that becoming quite defensive potentially.
I think, to be honest, I think that's exactly where LoopUp bring the value and why you'd want to work with a third party. Because if you're doing this yourself, you haven't you may be IT savvy, but you haven't got the telephony knowledge. You're going to be the one having that conversation with the carrier or the device manufacturer and having to prove that stuff yourself. LoopUp do this day in, day out, and we have this kind of knowledge, and we'll be able to kind of help you and guide you through that. So even if it's not LoopUp, I'd recommend you go through a third party for these deployments, but LoopUp can kind of deliver all of that for you.
So we've got a question from Scott come through there asking what we do about reception or attendant consoles, and this is kind of that back in the day there used to be the Link attendant console. Then as Scott mentions, there's the Landis Attendant Pro, which is a software application that interfaces with Skype for Business underneath. For Teams, there isn't quite that solution at this point in time. Like how do you have those discussions with a customer?
So again, we'll try to have those conversations nice and early. We'll understand what their current reception scenario is, and then we've had many situations where we'll plan out another solution which might not work exactly how it did before. And I think sometimes that's the hard thing for a reception to accept. They want it just to work how it did before, but actually there's things in the UC space where it can work in a better way. So we will work with the customer and we'll help plan out a better way for it to work. Then again, we'll run through all of that testing. We'll even involve the reception people and have them run through it as well and make sure they're comfortable before we roll it out in production.
And I guess my answer to Scott as well is that the model for how attendant consoles are built is changing. The reason that we've got this kind of gap between what we used to have and what the future will look like is that the clients, people like Landis or Luware, will be building their own attendant consoles that use the Teams API behind the scenes to manipulate the calls. Now, Landis obviously have had their product in a ready state for a very long time, but waiting for a few unlocks from Microsoft around those APIs to manipulate calls. Luware have their attendant console available. You can purchase it, but doing a consult transfer is currently not available. But I believe through the grapevine that, again, that's fairly close to going live. And when that API is available, then that bit of functionality will unlock. So it's not a perfect answer, but.
And again, that's where LoopUp had the value, right? Because we've had customers who've had that consult transfer issue specifically, and if you're doing this yourself, you kind of stuck. It's quite hard to navigate and find that information online. But I think obviously we've got the inside track, and we've been doing this for a long time, so we were able to kind of help the customer to understand the limitations of this space and suggest alternatives to them.
Yeah, and so Simon, they're asking, have you had scenarios where a user has more than one line on the legacy PBX? How do you handle that sort of stuff in the migration to Teams? I guess from my point of view, it's stripping it back to what the actual requirement for a second line is. Skype for Business used to have the notion of a private line, so that would you would give that out to friends, family, whoever needed it. It would bypass your DND and not hit voicemail, etc. In a Teams scenario, for example, we have a requirement where we might want to have salespeople in different parts of the world being able to dial out, not from where their native country or where their location is. So we handle that by having a little, you can do it two ways, either a little auto attendant that backs off to a call queue with the team when the user's in, and they can then dial out as that auto attendant, and then an inbound call will come back and be split between whichever users need it. Or you can have a resource account that you use as a delegate. And you assign the second number to the resource account and make the original person a delegate of it. It's not a perfect solution, but it does allow that functionality depending on what that original requirement for more than one line would be. Have you come across those types of scenarios, Adrian?
Not recently, but some of it is kind of educating the customers on challenging why you still need that in in your day to day, because I think the classic example is like hunt groups where the call would come in and it dials a big group of desks at once. Well, that was fine when you were all based in the office and everyone could hear everyone else's phone and pick it up. And customers asked for that to be replicated in Teams. Of course, people in Teams are distributed everywhere, and they're at home and they won't be able to hear someone else's desk ring. So being able to go through that with them and challenge exactly why do you still want that functionality? Does it really make sense in a modern workplace, right?
Good stuff. Well, I think we're sort of drawing towards the end of our time, but the question I guess would be, what's the main takeaway of prep that a customer to do can do, or what should they consider for their deployment of Teams telephony?
Yeah, I think I've laboured the point already, but the CSR working with the losing carrier and getting that CSR information up front is vital.
And I think you said that was kind of important, even if you're not necessarily looking at migrating away or doing other stuff with it. It just helps to make sure you've got a good understanding of what you're paying for and why and what those numbers look like, because it's part of that data cleansing, isn't it, of this user has this number and this main line has this number, etc., etc.
Exactly that. Yeah, spot on.
Good stuff. All right, well, thank you for taking the time today, Adrian.
Pleasure.
And and on that note, I think we're going to be talking to some of our engineering team on the next one of these, which is going to be on November the 25th, which is configuring Microsoft Teams telephony like a pro, as if you're not a pro already for us, Adrian. But thank you very much, and we'll catch everyone soon. Bye-bye.
Great.